remarkable series of anniversaries happened in this last year. The 500th year since the expulsion of our people from Spain. The 50th year since the Wannsee Conference in January of 1942, deciding on Hitler's final solution to the Jewish problem. The 25th anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem. So many other kinds of celebrations and anniversaries, not just for us, but throughout the world. I mean, very significantly, this was the 30th year since Marilyn Monroe's death. Here in our own congregation at Temple of Bethel, we have been this year, and our celebration will continue for a short while as we joyously remember the 70th anniversary of this congregation. And we give thanks for the lessons and for the examples and for the service of so many people who have served and led this congregation in its wondrous 70th year history.
Once upon a time, at the turn of the 20th century, a small band of pioneers made their brave decision to leave their homes and come to the Golden West. They traveled from Boston and Chicago, from Cleveland and Canada, by way of the Pale settlement of their birth. They had in common their courage, their drive, and that they were Jewish. And by 1923, there were enough of them to be a small Jewish community in San Pedro, California.
My name is Albert Kriegel. I was born in November 1919. Both of my parents came in from the old country. My dad came in 1901 through Galveston, Texas. My mother came in to New York from Bucharest, Romania. My mother settled in Denver, Colorado, and my father also had relatives in Denver, Colorado. But my father stayed down by Texas for a while, then he came back up to see his relatives, and that's how they more or less got together. And they came out here in 1916 and got married, and they lived on Bunker Hill for a while. Then they moved to Central Avenue. My sister was born in 1917. My other brother was born in 1918, I was born in 1919. But we moved to San Pedro in 1920. And my youngest brother was born in 1923 in San Pedro. Well, he wasn't in the hospital in San Pedro, so she gave birth in Long Beach.
My name is Jack Pike. I came to San Pedro from Lynn, Massachusetts, near Boston. 1921. Actually, September the 10th. And it's just a coincidence that that's the day, many years later, that Jackie passed away, September 10th. My father came a year before, and then my mother and my three sisters and I came across country on what Cecil B. DeMille called the Iron Horse, the train, and there was no air conditioning. It was miserable. We got to San Pedro late at night. We took the red car from Los Angeles to San Pedro and then took a taxi to a room that my dad had at 9th Street across from the Catholic Church. The reason I'm mentioning this, I finally got to sleep about 2 o'clock in the morning. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, I sat right up in bed. They were ringing the bells for the first Mass in the Catholic Church across the street. And I told the minister many years ago, I did appreciate it because it wasn't even by religion.
My family arrived in 1922 from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. At that time, we were 3 in the family, my brother Harry and my sister Ida. And I arrived in San Pedro when I was 6 months old. We went to Canada in 1921. We moved to a house, I believe, on 10th Street, and within a matter of months we wound up at 628 18th Street. And my family occupied that house for 17 years.
And we moved, the reason we really came to San Pedro is my dad decided to take a train from Vancouver to go to Long Beach on business, and he went on business to Long Beach and put money into an oil well, became a partner, and then he decided, well, he's going to move to San Pedro because he'd like to open up a new business, which he did. And I had a very interesting childhood. My mother was a businesswoman, and she was, when they came to San Pedro, of course, there was no kosher food to be had, so all of a sudden she became a reformed Jewess.
My name is Virginia Klein Cove. I came to San Pedro in 1925. I was almost 14 years old and entered San Pedro High School in the 10th grade. There was no temple in San Pedro at that time. My memory of Jewish people in San Pedro was going to services with my parents at the Oddfellows Hall on 10th and Gaffey. It was the first time I had ever experienced being Jewish.
I'm Sylvan Landy, but I arrived here in San Pedro in 1925. Came with my brothers and my sister and mother and father. And we arrived in San Pedro and we had a little apartment on 11th Street where we lived for about 2 years. And then we moved up to 13th and Mesa. And there at 13th and Mesa, we stayed for 15 years.
I'm Bill Landy, and I was 15, and I started high school here. And as far as the Jewish community was concerned, I mean, there were several Jewish kids. There was, I don't think there was any like the AZA or anything like that here.
I came out in December, and I got some help at work until I entered SC in the following September.
And what did you study there?
I took Kriegel. I took the 3 years accounting and 3 years of law.
I'm Landy, and I'm married to Sylvan Landy, and we were married in 1943, but the war was in progress, so we didn't come here till after the war in 1946. And I had been raised in San Diego, but had gone to school in Los Angeles and met there. And this was a very little town for me, and I didn't think I'd like it very well, but it turned out a bit different.
My name is Rita Landy. I'm married to Bill. I married him in 1947, lived here ever since. I came here from Beverly Hills, where I lived for about a year, but I was born and raised in the Midwest. However, like Evelyn, coming to San Pedro was like, to me, like the end of the earth. This was the last jumping off place, and there was not much here that I could see at the time. Since it's changed a great deal.
I'm Sylvia Landy, no L in my name. I'm married to Herbert Landy. We were married in 1935 and lived for a short time in Los Angeles, where I had lived before we were married. However, since my husband was a young attorney just starting out, and all of his cases happened to be in San Pedro, involved in the Merchant Marine or the Navy, we decided that it would be wise to move to San Pedro instead of commuting back and forth. And so in 1936, after about 6 months of marriage, we moved to San Pedro, where we've lived ever since. I forgot to tell you where I was from. I was from Cincinnati originally and came to Los Angeles when I was about 18 and lived there all through my UCLA days until I was married.
My family moved here either late 1928 or 1929. Moving from Kansas City, Missouri, first to Los Angeles, Boyle Heights, working for a cousin. My father went to work there in company called Kelly Pipe and Steel. When Kelly Pipe was closed, there were Mishpucha, other family members who had operations in LA Harbor. And so my father moved to San Pedro with my 3 brothers and my mother, and worked for Kriegel, which was then San Pedro Pipe and Metal, I believe was the name of the company. The Kriegel family was related in, Mrs. Kriegel's sister was married to my uncle. Maybe my wife ought to tell where her family started and how it came.
Well, my family, mother came from Russia to Cleveland and lived there for a while, and Dad was from Poland, and I've forgotten the name of the community. And they met in San Francisco on a little trolley car, and they lived in, got married in what's known as East LA now, the Borscht area, Boyle Heights area, by Breed Street Shul. And we used to go there every Sunday, so I remember that. We have 4 daughters in our family: Marilyn, myself, Rosie, and Sarah Faye, and Betty.
I'm Betty Waterman. This is my husband, Seymour Waterman. And we both lived in San Pedro a very, very long time. In fact, I've lived here all my life. I was born in the old St. Vincent's Hospital in Los Angeles. After I was born, they burned it down and built a new one. And I came to San Pedro as an infant. Lived on 9th Street. Because when my parents got married, my father was a tailor in San Pedro, and my mother followed him here.
And I'm Seymour Waterman. We came out here during the Depression. We lived in Los Angeles because my father was given a job by a distant relative, which in a year's time petered out. And we moved to San Pedro. My father was given a job by Mr. Joe Kriegel, who at that time was in the early 30s, had a salvage company or a junkyard, and they had a pipe and steel and things of that nature. And my dad worked as a very common laborer at that time and worked very, very hard. And I think that he started to work in the 30s. I think his salary was something like $20-some odd a week. And because of the Depression, because of the times and the people, my father earned something like $14 a week. I was about 5 at the time, or 6, somewhere in there. And we grew up during the Depression. This was a community of very few Jewish people. I doubt sincerely that there were more than 25, 35 families.
Born at the old San Pedro Hospital before the new San Pedro Hospital was even thought about. I guess I could be considered as one of the old-time Jews of San Pedro. This is my brother Newt.
And I was born in the same hospital 4 years later in 1933 after they cleaned the hospital out. And I can also be considered one of the Alta-Cocker old-time Jews in San Pedro, but 4 years less of an Alta-Cocker than Leah.
That's true.
Now, what do you remember about who got there first? I think the old man.
I think my father
Charlie Brown.
Arrived in San Pedro first. He was either a seaman or a longshoreman at that time. And somewhere or another, he met my mother, who was from Hattie Brown, who was from Boston, Massachusetts.
They met, if I remember correctly, because Charlie, the old man, was working with her brother as a longshoreman. Remember our Uncle Dick?
Dick Richards, who was another old-time member of the San Pedro community.
Incidentally, Charlie Brown's given name was Morris Scheinfeld. Remember that?
Moishe.
Yeah, Moishe Morris Scheinfeld. And when he decided he was not going into business and wanted to be a longshoreman, he changed it to Charlie Brown.
He told me the story that he changed his name because at one time he was fighting in the Dardanelles. Oh, he had joined the Canadian Jewish Battalion. We went up to Canada, joined the Jewish Battalion prior to WW1, so he could get into the war earlier, and it was something about fighting for Israel. It had been promised that if Jews were to get into the war, that was their fight, that they would be given us a white paper, I believe. So my father went out, joined the Canadian Army and the Jewish Battalion, and went out and fought. He ended up in the Dardanelles. He was torpedoed, and the reason he said something something to do with the security here.
Now, what happened was that the courthouse burned down and had all those papers. So when he tried to get back into the country, they didn't want him to, couldn't prove his citizenship, so they made him change his name from Horace Steinfeld to Charlie Brown.
By my father, Jack Colbert, an old-time resident, former resident of San Pedro. I've always felt a lot of warmth in the way my parents met. They both emigrated from Russia during the Russian Revolution in 1917. My father going to China and going to high school in China, and my mother coming through Ellis Island. They both met in Los Angeles and eventually ended up in San Pedro, where my father opened this business which I have today.
What year was that?
That was in about 1932 when my father opened his business here in San Pedro. And they had just gotten married, and of course we know in those years things were very difficult during the Depression. It was quite a thing to open a business in some of the toughest years we've ever experienced in this country. But somehow, through hard work and family help, they all survived. And I felt very fortunate that they were very dedicated to myself and my sister and my brother, and that we had a good, cohesive Jewish family.
My name is J. Albert Robertson, but in San Pedro I'm known by my middle name and the short name Al. Very seldom used the word J, and the reason for that is that when I grew up, I was a junior and always had to use my middle name so I wouldn't be confused with my father. So in San Pedro, my middle name Al was used mostly, and people would recognize me more by that name than they would by my first name. But J, in recent years, however, a great name, some people in San Pedro only by the name of J. And I came to San Pedro sometime during 1933 from New York because I had an uncle, my mother's brother, was in business in San Pedro on 6th Street. And I went to work as a accountant for Seaboard Motors, the Chevrolet dealer, who was then at 5th and Pacific.
I get a call from my brother-in-law, Beth, and he says he's coming over to take us to Los Angeles. Well, it was a very bad, I was surprised to hear that. I wanted to come here all the time. I wanted to come here to Los Angeles. But he came with his own car, and he stayed over. He talked things over. I says to my husband, Sam Corn, I says to him, I think it'd be a good idea to go back with Bender. So it took us one day to pack, and we went with his car, and I left my two sons with my mother and dad because I didn't want them taken out of school. And I met the family, and we stayed in Los Angeles for a little while. Then we were looking for something. From Los Angeles, we came to San Pedro. We found an apartment, not very far from the store, and we opened up the store. And then we sent to my son, for my children. They came in June after the school went out. They came.
My name is Leo Korn. I've lived in San Pedro since 1934. Came from Chicago, where I lived a very, very beautiful life there as a young teenager. We came here because my uncle Ben Bended, who you probably know, insisted that my father and my uncle Dave Korn come here to run some of his department stores. So we did in fact come. We went directly to Boyle Heights. At that particular time, I went to Roosevelt High School for 6 months, and then we found the opportunity of opening up our own business in San Pedro. And so my dad and I came here. We looked over the town and we liked it.
That was my husband's sister's husband, who came. I don't think any of you know him. A man by the name of Ben, who can sell you the wall or whatever. Just that kind of a personality. Then he came to us and told us the wonderful things that are in California, and why should you be here in this cold, miserable Chicago and things like that. So we decided to come. We broke up our little apartment, and my mother lived around the corner, and we left for California. And when we came to California, this was in the year of 1934. We celebrated the 1933 fair in Chicago, and it took us some time to get ready, and we came here in 1934 in June. So we decided to come to San Pedro, and Rita, the sister and brother-in-law who brought us originally here, also came to San Pedro. And pretty soon the family grew. There were 7 of us eventually. All came from Chicago. We all lived on 21st Street. There were 7 families on 21st Street in San Pedro. We were like 3 doors away, within a radius of 2 or 3 blocks.
I was born in Chicago, and in '36, my mother and I moved to San Pedro because my sister, Bernice Korn, had already lived here from 1933, I think. And so my mother and I, because I was just a little girl at the time, we moved to California to be with her. And so this is how we came to San Pedro.
I came here as a visitor to cousins who lived here after my first year in college. My Uncle Sam Korn was living here then with his family, and my Uncle Benjamin Bendat was living here with his family. And so I spent a beautiful 2 weeks in sunny California. Having lived in Chicago all my life, it was really an amazing thing to see how beautiful life could be. And I think it was then that I decided that if I could possibly do it, I was going to come to San Pedro and practice. By that time, my Uncle Dave Korn was living here. So I had 3 relatives back as far as 19... also, my Uncle Nathan Korn's family was here. So there were 4 members of the Korn family in 1945 when I was here the first time. 1944. And then after the war, when I had my California license as a reciprocity license from Indiana, I came out here by myself to see if there was a possibility of starting practice. And I went house shopping with my Aunt Bernice, and I picked up the phone and called Jenna in Chicago and said, "Come on out, this is where we are." So we got here in 1946.
Right.
And had a wonderful time in all those years.
Name, Trans Herman. And I came to San Pedro in November of 1952. That was the second time I came here. The first time I came here was in 1949. I had been married to my husband for 1 year, and we came to visit California to see all of his family in San Pedro. Now, the reason his family was in San Pedro is that his sister Harriet Korn had come to visit a cousin, and she met on a date Leo. Leo was in the service, and he came to Cleveland on his first leave to visit Harriet, and eventually, like a year later, they got married, and she stayed in Cleveland, and when Leo came out of the service, they moved to San Pedro. Harriet's parents also moved to San Pedro with their daughter and son-in-law, and my husband's brother Melvin and his wife Marion moved shortly after that, which left Jean and I the only ones of the Furman clan in Cleveland. My husband said, that is it. This is the last winter I will see snow. We are moving. And we moved in 1952.
I came out in June of 1941, and I had a cousin who lived in San Pedro. Her husband had a business here, Arthur Cooper and Harriet Cooper, and they told me that they wanted me to meet a young man who had a concession in the same store that Cooper's had there. And the next morning, I came in on Friday, and Saturday morning I went down to the store with her, and as we walked along 6th Street, she stopped in every other store to say hello to all the people that she knew on the block, and then we got down there to, I don't remember the name of the store, but Clark's, that's it. And she introduced me to Leo, and he asked me out that evening. We went to the Pike in Long Beach. We went for a dance, and then we went to the movies. And at 9 o'clock, I fell asleep because it was 12 o'clock in Cleveland, and I was tired. So he thought I was a nice, quiet girl. And I found the town very, very comfortable. The people were very congenial, and they made me feel comfortable.
Legally, I'm known as Nathaniel and Norman Prumis. I came here almost 60 years ago. I had a sister living here by the name of Sarah Scher. Her husband was Joe. They had a store on Harbor Boulevard, and I worked for them for a while.
My name is Sally Scher. My husband was Marty Scher. He was born in Virginia, Minnesota. That's where Norman Prumis lived. In fact, Norman Prumis used to diaper my husband. He was very fond of Marty. He was like a little brother. I mean, a real little brother, because there's a lot of age difference. They left Virginia, Minnesota, and they came to San Pedro.
My name is June Margolin, and I arrived as a new bride in San Pedro in 1940. And I met all the people who, unfortunately, today are not with us, but I was the youngest. Today, I'm probably one of the oldest. But it was a wonderful city, and they opened their arms to us, and we were poor. Let me tell you, my husband was a podiatrist from Cleveland, but he first had to get a license to practice. And my father and mother lived in San Pedro with my sister, who went to San Pedro High School.
In 1944, my parents, Manny and Edith Leventhal, and my sister Billy, and I drove from Chicago to take up permanent residence in San Pedro. And we lived in my grandfather's house at 1023 South Cabrillo. And that duplex is still there. My grandfather moved up then into the Montrose area. I'm not sure when he settled in San Pedro, and I'm really not sure of any involvement in the Jewish community. I became friends with Rosie Isbit. She was my first dear friend, and we're still friends. Still friends.
We were married in 41, and we came here in 1943. To Wilmington, and we lived there 2 years. So it was 1945 when we came to San Pedro. So I said, stay here in the car, or stay here, and I'll go into the next door shipyard, which was Western Pipe and Steel. Charlie
family had been employed by Consolidated. So I went to the next shipyard over, and I was immediately hired as a secretary in personnel. And I too said, I don't see how I could ever get here at 7:30. They were staggering their hours so there wouldn't be too much traffic. And just then one of the workers popped up and she said, oh, why don't you take our apartment? We're leaving because my husband's in the balloon garage and it's being moved to New Jersey. So I said, where do you live? So I said, okay, we'll go see what we can do. So we went over there immediately, and it was right in Wilmington, off of Figueroa Street and Anaheim, a little one-bedroom apartment. And the manager immediately said, oh, of course you can rent from us. It's $28.50 a month furnished, but no garage. But when we have a garage, we'll let you have it. That will cost you $2.50 more a month. I said, okay, we'll take it. And so we moved there from Los Angeles, and we lived there 2 years before we found out there was a town called San Pedro. There was a blackout. We never knew anything. We belonged to the Long Beach Temple, and we thought everything was going in that direction. And then somehow by chance we found out that there was a place called San Pedro, and we came over here, and we saw it was a beautiful little town, and we had decided by now that we wanted to live here all our lives.
I'm Bertie Ellis, the wife of the late Nat Ellis. We came to San Pedro in 1944 after Nat had a medical discharge from the Navy. And he, having been in the Navy and known the lingo, he opened a Navy store, a uniform store. He sold tailor-mades to the servicemen. And from the day that he opened the store, we felt so comfortable there. I have been living our home was in Long Beach, my family's in Long Beach, and the reason we came to San Pedro, we couldn't find a store in Long Beach to rent.
I'm Esther.
The way we got to San Pedro was very direct. I was in the Navy, and when I came back, I was discharged at Terminal Island, and my wife had a cousin that was working for San Pedro Jewelry and Loan, the Rappaports, and he wrote me while I was overseas, and he said if he would like to open a jewelry store. He was a watchmaker, and I was a salesman. We'd open the store, and we'd be in partners. We'd call it Port Jewelers. And when I came back, I came over on the ferry, borrowed his car, and went home to Bronson Avenue and Adams. And that was on January the 16th, 1946. And
I'm going to interrupt.
Go ahead, sweetheart.
When we moved down just a couple of days before Thanksgiving in 1946.
When I came back to the store, Jack Pike, who had the Boston Tailors across the street, came running across the street. He said, Mazel Tov, I understand you bought a home. I said, I just walked into the store. How could you know? He says, in San Pedro, everybody knows everything that's going on.
My first wife and I both lived in Chicago. My wife worked at the Railroad Retirement Board, a federal job. I worked for the Internal Revenue. We were both unhappy with things. We both left Chicago and came out to San Pedro August the 1st. We left August the 1st and we arrived here August the 3rd. August the 9th, I was in business already in San Pedro. I had 2 kids and had a tough time getting going.
So did you join about a year after you came here?
I came here in 46, 47, I found the temple. She had a rheumatic fever and she had a bad heart. And she needed open heart surgery. One day, Harriet decided, she said, Maury, I cannot be a wife to you. I cannot be a mother to my kids. And I don't want to be an invalid. I don't want to be a burden on you. I want to take that chance of surgery, which is 10% chance. She took the chance and she died. I'm going to ask Judy to tell you how I met her.
Mr. Beloved happens to be was my best friend's father, and he saw Maury coming back there and he said, Maury, this isn't good for you. How would you like to meet a nice Jewish woman with 2 kids?
No, a nice Jewish woman, but I'm sorry, she has 2 kids. Just 2, I wish she had 7. And,
So an introduction was made.
Yeah.
And 3 months later, we were married.
Well, a few months later, yeah.
My husband, he had been living in San Pedro and working on the docks. I had come from Los Angeles first, where I lived for 11 years. I had my family there, 3 brothers at first, and then some more of my family followed later on. And prior to that, I had come from Toronto, Canada. After having lived there for 15 years.
Tell me, how did you meet Mr. Turek?
Through an acquaintance. And through an acquaintance we got together, and of course he was anxious to get married right away, and I kept stalling him and putting it off. Yes, right, he wanted it right away. And finally, I had met him in August, and we didn't get married till March. So I arranged, when I finally set the date to get remarried, we were talking about the second time, I arranged so that it wouldn't interfere with my son's school, that he would transfer when he would have Easter break.
The Kriegel family company, the San Pedro Pipe and Metal, was involved in the industry of built around the harbor, which was canning and fishery and shipping, but also the hills behind San Pedro, Palos Verdes, were very active with Japanese truck farmers. My father's background was a welder, so it was a supply source for the Japanese farmers for their irrigation, and my father would go up and weld after the pipe was sold and work with them. San Pedro Jewish community was a very diverse community. Jews were involved in almost every occupation you could think of. And if you recall, it was the Depression.
There was a depression, but San Pedro really didn't have a depression. There was always people in San Pedro that made a living. You always made a living in San Pedro, and I found that out right away.
Yes, as a little boy I was told there were, I think, 12 members of the original charter members of the Longshoremen Union that were Jewish. And again, we have to remember these were Depression times. Whatever job you could get, you took. The number of the longshoremen were of Sephardic origin. And it gave a rich background again to the Jewish community, because you had such a mixture of people, rich, poor, laborers, teachers, merchants, ship chandlers, welders, tailors, shoemaker, candlestick maker, taxi cab driver.
Yes,
just trying to remember the various occupations that the Jewish population had in San Pedro. And of course, hotel operators. The Hirsch family came here during the war and bought the Cabrillo Hotel, and the family got very involved. Iffy graduated high school with Thelma, Rosie, and I at that.
Harold Forrester and
furniture stores.
Yeah.
Mrs. Gorby, the mother, wanted to open up a factory for making gefilte fish. So they came to Terminal Island, and they came at the right time because the war started, and then they became one of the great big fish canneries on a fluke, you know, and became very wealthy. They were from Washington, state of Washington. I'll give you a little example. B.B. Lipton told me this. He came here in about 1901 or 1902, and there was nothing here. And he opened up his business, which was very, very close to my store, and he became very wealthy. And all the money he made, he bought property. That's why he bought all the property on Pacific Avenue
had a lot of property up on the hills here, and he bought property, and that's the way it went with him. And in those days, if you went up and down the street in Pacific Avenue and 6th Street, you'd find every other store was a Jewish merchant. And that's the way it was.
My dad had a tailor shop at the corner of 6th and Beacon, which was then San Pedro. There were many Jewish tailors up and down 6th Street, and many Jewish people in business. You could, if you wanted to call a meeting of the emergency meeting of the Temple of the B'nai B'rith, you just had to walk up and down 6th Street and gather the members together, because they were all there. One or two were on Pacific Avenue.
My dad opened a business in San Pedro, and we used to have a men's store, clothing store on 6th Street. In those days, when you'd walk up and down 6th Street, there was nothing but Jewish owners. There wasn't a store that didn't have a Jewish owner.
What kind of business did you have?
Men's and boys' Levi's. That was the business to me at the time. I give him all the credit in the world for being such an astute businessman that he, hung in when he needed to. But the payoff is, we had a salesman that worked for Levi. His wife was the English singer. What's her name?
Anita Moulton.
Anita Moulton. Her husband was our representative. And he used to come down and take an inventory. And all of a sudden, when this merchandise came in, the order was so padded. If we ordered one of the size, we got 4 of the size. And we had like the biggest stock of Levi's in Southern California, even bigger than the Gap in the beginning. And then when the Levi's went public, and they put the Levi material on ration, well, we were the kingpin, because we got the biggest allotment. And we used to wholesale out the Levi's, to other stores would come down and buy them from Norman. So he really did us a favor.
War years, things were difficult for everybody. The Jewish kids in San Pedro had some advantages because of the merchants. I know that yes, if Levi's came into town, they were on ration or quotas for the merchants based on their previous before-war sales. So they get a very limited number of Levi's. But Arthur Cooper, who had a department store, or Norman Frumas would let the Jewish kids know that there were some Levi's in town. If we'd come down after school, he would save some for us. I also, underwear, same way. We would get our underwear that way because it was very scarce. Shoes, King Mazer would tell us he's got some shoes there. You'd have the coupons, you go to the store and there wouldn't be product. But the Jewish merchants saw that the Jewish kids had some of the products that were in short supply. We never had a credit card, Well, how did you shop? I said, well, I go to Arthur Cooper's department store, get a pair of Levi's. If I had any money, I paid him. If not, he had a little book underneath the cash register. And he would put down how Waterman owes him one pair of Levi's. And that tradition was carried on by many of the Jewish merchants.
Including your brother, your Waterman store did the same thing.
And the Jewish community sort of shopped that way, and you paid when you got a chance to pay.
William Fairley did that for us too, the $4 when we shopping.
WW2. The harbor was very busy. It was always full of battle wagons, battleships, cruisers, you name it. Look out and you'd always see the harbor just filled with ships. Beacon Street, Front Street at 2 o'clock in the morning was elbow to elbow. They were crowded. We had merchant seamen, we had sailors. This used to be a big port. As far as jobs are concerned, they were screaming for people. People came, that's from the Okies and Arkies, zoomed into this particular area. There must have been 6 different shipyards. Kaiser was turning out a ship a day. Now that's building ships. That's going some, but that was as many. He had more than one shipyard, but we had shipyards. We had Kaiser. We had, oh gosh, I don't even remember all of them, but we must have had 6 different. We had Todd. We had a Bethlehem. We had a big Ford plant. Yeah, we had a big Ford plant. We manufactured autos down here. There used to be a much greater manufacturing base down here than there is now. This was a big manufacturing
So I landed in San Pedro. That was in 1946 when I was discharged from the Army. So I just opened my office there at 529 West 8th Street, and at the same time I had an office in Los Angeles and also one in El Monte. So I was covering the county. At the time, there were only 2 ophthalmologists in the area, and then one of them moved away so that I was the only one around for quite a few years.
I've been in practice now, private practice, 21 years, and I still have, and I practice in Long Beach, I have a significant following from San Pedro.
I mentioned before that my mother was kosher. There was no kosher butcher shop in San Pedro or Long Beach. So every Friday we would go to Laurel Heights, and Mother would buy enough meat and things to last a week. Oh, eventually there was a Jewish butcher shop opened in Long Beach, and he delivered.
Was that it was very difficult to keep a physical house and find Jewish food in San Pedro. So there were 2 treks that were quite often made. Keeping kosher and soon disappeared. It was too difficult. But there was the trip periodically to the community market in Long Beach to get some kosher food. And the trips of nostalgia to Boyle Heights, to go up and down Brooklyn Boulevard and smell the pickles and get kosher slaughtered chicken.
There was a very nice community. People got together, they played cards, and during that time, people visited each other's homes, you know, and long before television, they even got together to listen to the radio, you know. Not everybody had a radio, because we didn't have a radio. We couldn't afford a radio.
I can remember it was idyllic. It was absolutely the most wonderful time for kids to grow up. We could walk on the streets, you know, 24 hours a day. Everybody was in the same economic position because we were really in a working class town. Tiny business people mainly struggling to make a living. Some of them were better off than others. There was a Lippman family who were very well off. There were a few people that were pretty well off, but most of them were really struggling to make a living. It was very tough. We had a few people, Ray was an insurance man, but by and large there were not a heavy professional group of people at that time.
When they were growing up, this was a very unusual community. The Italians, the Slavs, took very, very good care of their children. There wasn't any question of alcohol or drugs or anything else in this town. We had a very small Jewish community. The confirmation class usually consisted of 7 or 8 people, maybe less. And as the kids were growing up, the one thing they wanted to do was to get away from San Pedro because there was nothing for Jewish children here.
And everybody lived in each other's apartments because there was a whole group there, the Smugglers and Joe's brother Irving and Lil, and all these friends. They made friends and then they all moved to Lakewood. Bob and Evelyn Singer were their friends also. And Bob Singer was the son of Eli and Ruth Singer. Eventually all these people most of them moved on to Lakewood.
We're non-Jews, and we got along famously, no problem at all. I found no anti-Semitism at all in San Pedro. Everybody was like one big, happy family. You know, I had my Gentile friends, and then I would turn around and have my Jewish friends, and it worked out really well.
So during the high holidays, Rabbi Horowitz, in his sermon, criticized the Portuguese Building Club because they wouldn't allow Jews as members. and he said some kind of Hebrew saying, and they should go down into the sea. Well, lo and behold, it wasn't longer than a couple of 3 years that the Portuguese Band Club sank into the ocean.
I got a call that they had set the meeting for the Portuguese Band Club the next day to meet and discuss the possibility of starting this Doctors' Wives Guild. I said to the ladies very honestly that I had heard, that I knew from what I had heard, that the Portuguese Band Club was anti-Semitic. And because of that, I couldn't feel free to go there for lunch, even though I would have been a guest of one of the members. And I might add that this group was in existence possibly 25 years thereafter. Never once was it brought up to go to the Portuguese Band Club. But a little added bit of information, it slipped into the ocean, to my delight.
There was some anti-Semitism that we detected when I was president of the B'nai B'rith. It apparently was something that had been handled by the officers so that there was not a Jewish member in the Lions Club. Well, there was a big hoo-ha about that. And it came to a point, and now I think there are any number, and have been for some years, of members in the Lions Club, and very productive ones.
And during the war, I was a lead man in the shipyard. At one time, one of the boys came up to me and they said, they're going to get you tonight because some of these boys don't like to have a boss for a Jew. So during the lunch period, which was a swing shift, I got up and I said to them, I've heard that some of you boys don't want to work for me because I'm a Jew. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll take you on one at a time, as far as I can go, and we'll see what happens. And the first thing you know, 41 men got up in back of me, and they said, you'll have to take us too. That was one of the greatest moments of my life.
And at those times, actually, being I was, married during the war, and when Jewish people at first always say what they were or what they weren't, when I came here, I just, we weren't as involved, I don't think, as people are today. We weren't as much. We did little by little, but it took a while because after the war, I think people began to really say I'm Jewish and not worry about it.
I was drafted with Irving Korn, Leo's brother. We were stationed together in Aberdeen Proving Grounds. We finished our basic training, and then we switched to a different part of the camp. We stayed there for about a year. Then I spent the rest of my time in Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. My youngest brother enlisted in the Air Force. He wanted to be a pilot, but he ended up being a bombardier, and he was over there in South Pacific and Morotai for about a couple of years. And so we were all in the service, and thank heaven we all came back.
I went into service here at Fort MacArthur, and they sent me to Fort Knox, Kentucky. And I went to a basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and the rest of the bunch went to the 1st Armored Division, went over to Africa. So 9 of us, 4 Jews and 5 Gentiles, started a gunnery school, became the biggest and best gunnery school in the country.
Did we lose any young men from the Jewish community during the war?
I don't believe anybody passed away. I may have been the closest one to getting killed because I was almost killed 5 different times, and I may have been the only one to get decorations like the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star.
But I was aware of what the Nazis were doing, and I was aware of the fear that instilled in everybody. And some of my greatest fears and recollections was during that time when we actually had blackouts in San Pedro, when we were instructed to pull down our shades and turn on our lights because we had an air raid warning. We had the big searchlights. And my father was an air raid warden. It was his job to go out into the street and make sure everybody was off the streets.
During the war, they were active. A lot of women became active in the USO, the local USO. They were active in promoting sales for U.S. savings bonds, and they contributed to the war effort as much as they could.
I think Hitler probably sensitized the Jewish community throughout the world and made them a little more conscious of their Jewishness.
I don't know if you remember Beacon Street. It used to be the most dangerous part of Skid Row, St. Pedro. It was the dangerous part in the whole world, in our country. In our country, rather. It was dangerous street to go on. No one would dare walk on Beacon Street, especially during at nighttime. They eventually cleaned it up.
Shanghai Red was a most unusual character. There were 3 places in the world that were known to every sailor around the world. One of them was in Macau, one of them was Shanghai Reds, and the other one I've forgotten. But as I say, Shanghai Red's little finger was larger around than my thumb, and on it he wore a 12-carat diamond ring, which wasn't real perfect. It was yellow in color. But that diamond ring and his hand was so large that if a sailor was unruly, he could reach across the bar and get him and lift him up directly.
Shanghai Red was known throughout the world. After all, this was a sailor town. And these sailors would come here and they'd go to Shanghai Red. Shanghai Red, we found out, was a Jew.
Redhead.
He was a redhead. And he was across the street from, he used to come over all the time and kibitz with me when I had my business. And he was a real character. You just couldn't believe he wasn't afraid of anybody. These guys would get drunk, you just pitch them out like you never seen anything like it. Shanghai Red, every time we needed money, I'd go over to see Shanghai Red, he'd give me cash. And
he also contributed wine, like for Passover.
And Red Eisenberg would, in fact, get all this stuff, and he would feed these longshoremen and people until the strike was over, and he had a good reputation, but he was an awfully strong guy. And then you asked me beforehand about the 2 prostitute madams we had in St. Peter's. I might as well tell you that they used to come into my store and they were my customers. And they would do a lot of talking. There was Millie, who had a place on 6th Street, and she had a sister Kay who had Alhambra Hotel on Beacon Street.
There was a Jewish man.
Neither one of us were there, but as I remember the story, this blonde lady came in with her furs with her Jewish husband and came to what was it, Seder or some sort of a temple dinner, and sat down there, and a lot of these men knew her. They were going like this. She was wonderful until she opened her mouth, and I understand that she had quite a few crude remarks to make. Prior to the founding of that temple, there was a very strong organization in this town, St. Peter Jewish Sisterhood. This is before almost any other Jewish organization. They were really the old, not the old, but the people that were rallied around that group. And they were the ones that produced the money to establish the temple, establish the building of it. And in those days, there was a lot of arguments about temples and buildings. But the St. Peter Jewish Sisterhood that built a community center.
That was on 19th and Cabrillo. There's about 20 women that raised funds, making cookies, having dinners and theater parties, and they worked for quite a few years to really do this. There was a lady named Mrs. Rosenfeld who owned the land, and she gave the land to these women, and then they got a hold of a builder, and the builder, which I think it was $7,900, was that what it was? Built this building on the corner of 19th and Cabrillo.
Then, of course, the evolution was 19th and Cabrillo, where the synagogue, the Jewish Sisterhood building was located, and where services were held, and also B'nai B'rith meetings were held. It was a sort of an interwoven community set up with the B'nai B'rith and the sisterhood and the B'nai B'rith auxiliary. In those days, there was a definition between the women's group and the men's group of saying, now understand it's together.
We cooked dinners, and we sold tickets, and we had bond rallies. Every social gathering in town, everyone participated. Everything was centered in this building. We had no temple, so sometimes we would have a visiting rabbi. Many times we didn't. We really didn't have the money. The times were different at that. It's to raise monies was the most important thing. We had speakers come in. We became very much involved with B'nai B'rith. And much of this also, I was not very involved in the sisterhood. They were an older group, and the younger people were much more involved in B'nai B'rith.
The then Jewish Community Center on 19th and Cabrillo, where we had many activities, mostly B'nai B'rith, because Judaism at that time was not a practicing religion as far as San Pedro was concerned.
And Edith Leventhal was the first one who came to visit us. And she said, well, I'd like you to join the sisterhood. I said, well, I said, we can't afford to join the temple yet. We're only getting started. She said, you don't have to join the temple to be a member of the sisterhood. At that time, it wasn't obligatory. So she said, it's only $3 a year. I said, well, in that case, count me in. And that's how I met all the women.
There were many activities at the center at that time. There were dances, there were dinners, and they weren't expensive. Of course, money was at a different point than it is now, but I mean, we used to go constantly. That was our center of entertainment, was to go to the center for a potluck or for a dance or for so many things. Some of them were put on by the temple, some of them were put on by B'nai B'rith. B'nai B'rith was very, very social active. They were very, very involved in having social things going on, and there were many of them.
And there was Seymour and Betty, and we'd go to one another's house, and the Marcuses, and the Pikes, and the Margolins, and the Horns. We'd have a whole group every Saturday night. We'd go out and celebrate. We didn't go to nightclubs or anything, but in each other's houses, we'd serve dinner, and it was nice. It was very nice.
We would meet every weekend, and we would play cards. The women would play cards, and the men would play cards. And I'll try to remember who they were. It was Dr. Korn, Dr. Kaufman, Dr. Margolin, Martin Scher, Norman Trumas, and myself. And we were constant community together.
There was a number of Jewish boys and girls. It was enough to start an AZA, and they had a B'nai B'rith Girls that Shirley was a member of.
Very much in the AZA when we were youngsters, 14 and 15, during the time of our high school period. The AZA was very important in San Pedro. And I think just about everybody that I knew, almost every one of the Jewish boys and girls belonged to AZA. And at that period, we went forward and we met girls, especially out of town, because you all know that the girls in your own hometown are a little different. So we had wonderful times traveling to different AZA conventions and meetings throughout Southern California. Some of us went on to conventions. That was it.
And they had bridge parties, and then they had study groups. Not too many study groups, because most of those women were just really homemakers, and they didn't have time for extracurricular like that. And then when the B'nai B'rith women became very, very important, and I really mean important, then we had all kinds of classes and groups, meetings, and educational things, and we had started a Sunday school.
I got married in 1936. And where I lived when I was married was right on 19th and Gabrilla, right on the corner there, the duplex. And I was the superintendent, they called me, of the Sunday school. I had 20 pupils in the whole school at the time. And every Sunday morning, after we did our little services and lessons with the rabbi, they'd come to my house for cocoa, marshmallows, and cookies.
We joined the temple in 1942.
What was it like?
It was a hall with a stage, with a curtain. It was nice. It was all right. We had a very nice rabbi. Of course, they changed rabbis here like underwear. Just like underwear. It was amazing how they changed a rabbi. If one didn't like him, so the other one liked him. So if that one didn't like him, we couldn't have him. So they got rid of him. We had more rabbis, I think 20
there. And we had all kinds of rabbis, you know. We had a series of rabbis. And some of them were great, some weren't. And my mother was very involved in what was going on. She was sort of the leader.
And it seemed before the new temple was built that there were distinct factions in the temple. There were the Orthodox, there were the conservative, there were the Reformed. And it was hard, I think, for any rabbi to make that all work.
I think one rabbi's name was Halevi. Now, Shirley and I were married already when he was there. He was very well educated, but he could not give a sermon. 2 minutes after he started, he'd be wandering all over the place. But he was very well educated. He came over to visit us one night, and we sat down. Maybe there was half a dozen of us. And before we knew it, it was 2 o'clock in the morning.
And Rabbi Halevi was a sad man because his wife was not well. She couldn't participate in anything.
So I told the congregation, whoever was the rabbi at that particular time, that I will in fact come to services every Friday and I will act as cantor. There was no money involved. I will be a cantor every Friday night, and I will be the cantor at all of the bar mitzvahs on Saturday morning, which I did. I left my business, I went over, became the cantor on Saturdays, cantor every Friday night. But you got to remember that the music that I sang was the same music over and over again. It wasn't like today where they will change the music and they'll get into a big deal.
Involved with the Sunday school, and that was in the old building, 19th and Capella.
You taught in Sunday school, or you were the principal of the Sunday school?
I was both, but originally in the old building, Rabbi Kramer was the rabbi, and we worked there under very minimum situations and no budget. You were talking about budget. That was a word that wasn't in our vocabulary. We had none. And he was a very wonderful person to work with.
Kramer had everything going for him. He was inventive, articulate, intelligent. His sermons had something to say, but he didn't register with the community because he dressed like a hippie.
Had a good sense of humor.
Yes.
Was non-judgmental.
Right.
And you felt like you were really his friend.
That's right, and he was a brain.
Yeah.
And then when Rabbi Kramer was there, my husband was president of the temple, and my home was the second home for Rabbi Kramer. Saturday nights he had nothing to do, he was single. And so he would want to go where the people are. He'd find out where we were, and that's where he'd come just in time for a bite to eat.
It was a community building. It acted as everything. It acted as as a sanctuary. It acted as a meeting house for Sunday schools. It did everything.
Not only wanted that one building, we wanted a temple. We wanted our children to have Jewish life. And if you don't have it, we didn't want to raise children here without that. And then came Rabbi Horowitz, a very nice man. He saw the need, and he also saw the potential. And he said to my husband, Dave, if you give me $1,000 in my hand and go up and down 6th Street, he said, we'll raise money for a temple. My husband says, Rabbi, I will do it. Most of the businessmen on 6th Street at that time were Jews. So they go up and down the street, and the rabbi says, I have $1,000 that Dave Gorin gave me. I want you to match it. And believe it or not, it was matched up and down the street.
Horowitz was he was a good rabbi. He was very, his wife was a good rabbi, and they were an issue.
He was the one that was instrumental in helping getting this temple on 7th Street. He went out and he solicited money, and he got B.B. Lippman for a commitment, which then was a big contribution. He was committed for $5,000. That was a big donation.
You don't know who B.B. Lippman was. B.B. Lippman was a multi-millionaire. He owned about 2/3 of the property in San Pedro. Monsignor Scott and I walked into his store, and he was sitting at the desk. And he stands up and he greets Monsignor Scott. And Monsignor Scott walks in, pats him on the back, and he said, I want to personally thank you for the donation to our new church. And he said, surely it must be an oversight on your part, because my friend Lou Marcus here says that you haven't made a pledge to the temple yet. So B.B. Lippman says, oh, yeah. Well, you'll at least do as well as you did for the Catholics, for your own people, won't you? B.B. Lippman writes a check like this, and he says, and don't you ever ask me for another penny.
You know, the community had grown, and they always wanted to build a community center. They actually wanted to build a synagogue. And the 7th Street was a central location that they finally found, and something that they could afford. There were a couple other lots that were available to us. It was available all the way to the corner to Weymouth, but we couldn't afford to buy it. We should have, but we couldn't.
Now Rosser had an idea. Rosser said, let's buy the balance of the property for a little nothing all the way to Weymouth. But the board said, no, we don't need it. You know, and they didn't buy it. Had they bought it, they could have had a temple now like you wouldn't believe.
It was $750 a lot. And we wanted to buy the property all the way to Weymouth. They stopped at a certain point and wouldn't let us buy the property all the way to Weymouth. Can you imagine if we had had our way, what Temple Bethel would look like today?
Building the temple, it was lovely. Compared to what we had, it was a lovely place. And I'll never forget, Al Robinson decided everybody should come up with $1,000. And one said, I haven't got it. He says, so you'll get it. And they did. They did. And we built the temple. Of course, too bad we didn't buy more land at the time. He did. He wanted them to buy more land.
But, you know, when they went to build a building on 7th Street, the Jewish Sisterhood said they would sell the one on 19th at Cabrillo. I'm not sure how much they got for it. I know my brother-in-law Joe at that time was very active in it.
What's his last name?
Rostiger.
What they asked them to do was to sell that building and turn the money over to an entirely different organization. And
There was some opposition.
there was opposition, but as always.
I'm sure that's why it's called Temple Bethel and Center, because I think that's, the word center is the historical connection.
Exactly.
To the fact that once it was a center.
Could very well be.
And I think that's also reflected in the two sisterhoods that were formed when Temple Bethel opened its facility on 7th Street, because there was still that nucleus of the old Jewish sisterhood.
It lasted for years. Are they still in existence today?
No longer.
Do you remember anything about the planning for the sanctuary in terms of the stained glass?
Of course, I was involved in all of that. I was president of the board all during that period. As a matter of fact, if it wasn't for the commitment that we had there, and for just a few of us, Lou Marcus and myself,
Who was vice president?
and Judy Kaplan helped. Judy Kaplan helped.
Marvin became a lifetime member of the board when he was nominated by Seymour Waterman at a board meeting, because of all the things that he'd done all through the years. Like when the building was going up, he went every day to the temple to see every nail that was going into that building. He was like a supervisor, like a contractor. And he went, first he'd go to the temple, then he'd come to the store. And so anyhow, Seymour Waterman decided it was time for him to become an honorary lifetime member. And he nominated him. It was 100% go.
You know who Rebecca is? Rebecca Johnson.
I think she tells us
I got $20,000 from Rebecca. And I owed her half of my life for that $20,000.
We had a building going up, a hollow shell with dirt in the middle, and no plans for what to do inside. So somebody suggested calling Rabbi Kramer. So I called Rabbi Kramer, and he said, I know of one man excellent for the job, Eric Ray. We got up to 7th Street, and we walked in from the open back. And he walked down the dirt, the middle aisle, and he got halfway down, and all the time he was talking and saying, he's sorry he can't do it, he's sorry he can't do it. And all of a sudden he stopped in the middle of that floor, and he didn't move. It was as if he didn't breathe. And then he turns to me and he says, I'll do it. I said, you said you were busy? There's something here.
The beauty of just the empty shell, and that the idea seemed to like flash in his mind, and he knew what he wanted to do, and he said he would do it. Now the story of the Zebulon on the wall, that was his idea because we were a seaport. Zebulon was the only tribe that went to sea. And he thought he'd have like a storm-wrecked ship. And if you look at the ship, you can see it looks like it's storm-wrecked. And it's facing the ark where God brought it home to its port. And that was his thought, and that was why he built that. And if you notice the lettering on the ark, when the doors are closed, I don't know the words in Hebrew, but the rabbi could tell you. The quotation is that you always come back to God, and you should ask the rabbi to
He made a path, and he shall make a path through the water.
And he formed the letters so that the letters are the door handles. He did all that. It was just beautiful.
And the doors, everything's olive wood.
And yeah, it's olive wood from Israel. And the eternal light with the Shaddai on it, that was his work too.
Anyway, Mr. Judson took me into his office, and he had a 1906 Encyclopedia Britannica. 1906 or 1907, in that area. And in there were 2 pages of pictures of the colors of the breastplates of the 12 tribes, the priest of the 12 tribes of Israel. I didn't know such a thing existed. And he found it, showed me, and he said, these are the colors you should incorporate in your temple wall. And the design of the windows in the back.
And
if you turn around as you go in, you see all the squares. That's from the colors of the breastplates.
The colors of the breastplates are on the back wall. And also the menorahs. He said, what are you going to have there? And we told him, we showed him the design. He said, you're going to have all the different colors. I'll work with Justin in the colors. Judson. He said, I'll work with them because the colors should spread out and it should be like the, what is it, the symbol of the priestly blessing. That was his idea too. That's the reason for the colors. I think people would like to know these things.
Decided to hire was his name Ray, I think?
It was a joint decision of the board, and the one that was most taken with him was, Lou Marcus. Lou Marcus was the one that was most involved with that, most taken with him.
And they didn't want to go for the bottom of that.
And also the rabbi was very taken with him too.
Yeah,
Hellman was very, very much impressed with him.
What about Rabbi Hellman?
He was intense and young. And also, he was very intelligent.
You remember Hellman? He was there when I became president. And he did start adult classes for a while in the evening, and I enjoyed that.
Rabbi Hellman is remembered by an extraordinary number of people in the history of the Temple Bethel as a great, kind, and compassionate human being, a distinguished rabbi and a wonderful scholar, a man who brought a unique personality to service in the rabbinate here in this congregation and in the other places where he has served. I'm very happy to introduce to you and to welcome to our pulpit again, to say welcome home to Rabbi Leonard Hellman. You're not supposed to stand, right? There's a famous story about Rabbi Solanter. He felt that for the good of the people of the community, they should drink water on Yom Kippur. Nobody wanted to drink water on Yom Kippur until Rabbi Solanter got into the pulpit and had a glass of water and drank it. And with that, everybody drank water. This temple and this congregation has very fond memories for me.
But his stay was also short-lived.
And who came after him?
Rabbi Weisberg. His wife's name was Dee Dee. And she didn't take any part at all in the sisterhood at all.
An interview to see if we could make a match between me and the congregation for me to become the rabbi here. Someone on the interview committee asked me, Rabbi, do you play bridge? I said, no. They said, that's great, you're hired.
We're interviewing for new rabbis, for a new rabbi. And Rabbi Lee came to talk to us. And then after he left, the consensus of opinion is no. He wouldn't do. No experience, never had a pulpit. I said, we've had rabbis that have had pulpits, and I wouldn't give them the place to put their hat. I said, I think he's the man that'll be good for us. So they had the meeting and they hired him. And I love him. He's a wonderful person.
I guess the community loves him too. He wouldn't still be there.
Yeah, he's just a wonderful person.
And I'm happy to speak to you here at the end of this presentation about what it is that we have been celebrating and what it is that the true source of our happiness is. It is also important to remember what it is that we're not celebrating. This is not the celebration of 70 years of a building, 70 years of an institution. This is the celebration of 70 years of an organized Jewish community in this beautiful little town of San Pedro. This is a celebration of the simple good fortune that it means that an extraordinary group of people found their way to this place between the rolling hills and the Pacific Ocean and built here this Jewish community that we honor this day and in this program. A gathering of unique and courageous and loving people. A gathering also of an argumentative and contentious and very funny people. Educated, caring people who built a Jewish community here because they happened to be committed to a purpose beyond themselves. Jewish people who did their parts and who exercised their energies for something other than themselves, for their children, for the Jewish people in this town, and for the unfolding story of the entire Jewish world in the 70 years that they were here. The number 70 is not insignificant in Jewish life. In the Mishnah, in this great book of Jewish law, there is a teaching that at the age of 70, a person feels a certain kind of sheva, a certain kind of fulfillment and satisfaction. A person attains the ability to look at his life or her life and to say, this is the way it ought to have been. This is the way that God intended the 70 years of my life to be. And it makes me feel good, and it makes me feel gratified. That is what we also feel about the life of this community. It makes us feel good. It makes us feel fortunate that we have been here. This Jewish community has been, is, and will always be, I think, a source of pride for its members, a place where people go for caring, for celebration, a place where people will find the comfort that they need in times of difficulty, a place where people will find the friends who will share with them the joy that they have experienced in their lives. This is a place, I think, where people have been able to sense God's presence, where they know that their prayers have meant something when they have been shared with the people of this community. All of that has happened because of the people and the stories that you have met and heard. All of that has happened because of the people that we have all known here in this wonderful place. We pray that as this congregation grows to 120 and beyond, that those of us who will lead this congregation in the future will honor the devotion of those who built this community by continuing to make the Jewish community of San Pedro reflect the convictions and the beliefs and the purposes of those who have brought us to this place. May we go from strength to strength, from celebration to celebration. May we share many wonderful anniversaries in this Jewish community of ours. Thank you.